Hello everybody and welcome to this evening's local group online talk. My name is Harriet and I work for the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust, and I'm joined this evening by David and Jack from the Leicestershire and Rutland Badger Group, and Helen O'Brien and Sam Devine-Turner, who are going to present to you this evening about dormice. Before we get going, I just want to let you all know that if you could pop any questions throughout the talk in the Q&A box at the bottom, and then once the talk's over, we'll go through as many questions as we've got time for. And we are really delighted to be able to offer these talks for free, but if you would like to give a donation to help support the running costs of the talk, the talks that we're putting on, and also to support the work we do for wildlife across Leicestershire and Rutland, please head to our website at lrwt.org.uk/donate. Okay, enjoy the evening, everybody, and I'll now pass over to David.
Okay, thank you, Harriet, and good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Badger Group's latest Zoom meeting. I can see we've got at least 141 people already online, which is great. For those who don't know you, I'm David Duckett. I'm chairman of the Leicestershire and Rutland Badger Group. And our group is affiliated to the Wildlife Trust. So we actually run as an independent group as well with our own membership. And of course, a plug here, we're always looking for new members. So if anybody fancies joining the Leicestershire and Rutland Badger Group, please look online at our badgergroup.org.uk website. Perhaps Harriet can put that on the bottom for you to be able to see that. Thank you. Okay, over to tonight's talk, which is obviously the event of the evening. I'm pleased to say that we have two speakers tonight. In addition to the named speaker, Sam Devine-Turner, who's going to talk obviously on the ecology of the dormouse, we have a surprise bonus of Helen O'Brien joining us. Most of you will know Helen. She is mammal recorder for Leicestershire, and she's also a senior nature conservation officer for Leicestershire City Council. Sam, who is chair of the Shropshire Dormouse Group, has offered to give a talk from afar. It wouldn't have been easy had we not been doing it via Zoom. She'd have had a long journey. But I'm sure doing it from home or wherever she is going to be just as good. So if I can hand over to our two speakers tonight to talk on the ecology of the dormouse. Thank you both.
Hi, and thank you very much, David. I'm just going to share my screen now. And hopefully everyone can see. Got a thumbs up, brilliant. Let's get this going. Oh. Sorry, can't quite hit the menu at the top of the screen. Bear with me 1 second. Right, there we go. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking tonight and to be able to deliver this talk. Just wanted to give you a little bit of a background about me. So I'm an ecologist. I spend a lot of my time out in nature. And as David mentioned, I'm the chair of Shropshire Dormouse Group. So just for a little background on Shropshire Dormouse Group, we've been going about 5 years. We started monitoring dormice on some Shropshire Wildlife Trust sites, and over the years we've added in more sites that we monitor. We've also now built up a habitat management team as well. We'll talk about why that's necessary later on. And we deliver talks and trainings, so talks such as this one, trainings for people to train up for their dormouse licence, which is to handle dormice. And we visit local landowners, give advice, that kind of thing as well. And I also run my own business, Scruff Stuff, and through that I deliver sessions such as mammal tracks and sign sessions for organisations such as the Field Studies Council. I'm also currently working on building up some monthly nature connection sessions. So if anyone's interested in that, do give me a follow on Facebook or Instagram. So enough about me. Let's move on to the star of the show. So what is a dormouse? So the hazel dormouse, or Muscardinus avellanarius, is our only native dormouse in the UK. We do have another dormouse. It's known as the edible dormouse, or Glis glis, and that is the non-native species, and it's only in specific parts of the UK. But the hazel dormouse that you see on the screen is our native species. They're quite a small animal. They're roughly sort of 50 millimeters from head to bum. Their tail can be just as long again. Although the dormouse you see on the screen was rather affectionately known as Stumpy because he only had half a tail. And you can just about see where his tail meets his chin. There's a little kind of black end to the tail, and that shows that there was damage to his tail. But usually they have longer tails than this, which you'll see on many more photos later on. Dormice are not mice, so they are rodents, but they are in their own family, the dormice family, or Glirida, and they have a whole lot of differences about them, which we'll cover over the upcoming slides, which make them very different to mice. A key feature is that they're nocturnal, so they have these lovely big black eyes. This doesn't mean they don't come out in the day at all. As you'll soon see, hazel dormice don't read the books at all. They don't always do what they're supposed to do, but they are predominantly nocturnal, so they mostly come out at night time. Another key thing is that they are an arboreal species, so that means that they live in the trees and the shrubs. Again, it doesn't mean they never come down to the ground. There are records of them doing that, but they do prefer to stay up in the trees and travel through arboreal connections. You can see on this photo their hind feet. They have extremely well adapted hind feet for climbing. So the pads on those feet are incredible. They're really complex, and I can sort of attest to their climbing ability because of these feet, having had dormice run up my arm and end up on my head at least twice. They are amazing climbers. So I'm going to touch on distribution of dormice. The map on the left, this was produced by the People's Trust for Endangered Species, and I'll mention them a lot throughout this presentation. The map on the left of 1885, that shows dormice distribution in that year. So you can see that dormice were pretty much throughout most of England and Wales, more common down south, and only absent from a couple of counties. But fast forward to 2016, when the last State of Britain's Dormouse report was released, and you can see that they are now extinct from, I think it's 17 counties. So they're only considered to be present in about 32 counties. This doesn't include reintroductions. So if you look at the map on the right, there's some red dots on your screen. On the map, and this was in 2013, so those are reintroduction sites. I'm not going to talk too much about reintroduction. You can find online a report from the People's Trust for Endangered Species on all of their reintroductions across the UK. So it's a really brilliant report. It talks about some of the successes and some of the failures, and speculation as to why some might be successful and others might not have been. Well worth a read. Now, I wanted to talk about distribution in Shropshire. I realise that a lot of people watching this will probably be not from Shropshire, but with it being my background, even within Shropshire, the kind of geographical range of dormice has reduced drastically. So the yellow shapes on the map are old records, whereas the red shapes are much more recent records. So you can see that even within Shropshire, dormice have kind of retreated from the north of the county and are only, as far as we know, present in the south of the county. And if we just pop back to this map, you can see that at least in England, Shropshire is at the northernmost kind of edge of the range of dormice now. So we would really like to find out perhaps why we can't find dormice in the north of the county, and perhaps there is scope for reintroduction in the future. Now, with this being a talk for Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust and Badger Group, I wanted to find out a little bit about kind of historical records of dormice in the county. And so I contacted Helen. So I'm going to pass over to Helen now for just a little while, if that's okay, Helen, to talk a little bit about some of her work.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. That's a great introduction, and you know, certainly sets the scene for us here in Leicestershire and Rutland. As you can see from the map on the left-hand side, the 1885 and the 2016 one, Leicestershire and Rutland have always been really counties that where they've struggled to support dormice. In the 1885 map, it's shown as rare, a rare species, and in 2016, it's all but disappeared. So you know, we have been struggling over a number of years, to say the least. The report that you see on the right-hand side is one that we've been involved with fairly recently, myself and one of my ex-colleagues now at the City Council, Barry Ingram, where we tried to really put a concerted effort into finding whether dormice were in the county, and particularly in the Rutland area. So Sam, can you take me on to the next slide, and I'll just give a little bit of background about that. So really from an historic background, as the previous slide showed, we were struggling for quite a long period of time, and the main distribution of dormice in the counties has been to the east, particularly around the Rutland area. When you look at our maps on the right-hand side, you see two maps, one showing pre-2000 and one showing post-2000. These maps have been produced from data from the Leicestershire and Rutland Resource Centre, and this is a fantastic resource that we've got here in the two counties that collates the data from a number of sources. From the People's Trust for Endangered Species, from Natural England, from the Mammal Society, from casual records, ecology consultants, you name it. You know, we don't favour anybody, we just put it all on. So it's a very comprehensive data set. But actually, when it comes down to dormice, we're really struggling. So from the date when records were first collated, we have a total of 13 records of dormice in the county, and pre-2000 we have 11 records, and post-2000 we have 2 records. So most of those records pre-2000 have actually come from the Rutland area and from the ancient woodlands that remained after a lot of them had been cut down and areas turned into arable land or have since been developed. So the main woodlands are Ouston Wood and Lawn Big Wood, and we have the first record actually from 1948, and we had a few odd individual records going up to 1976 from individuals living in the area who might have found them in their gardens, or from the forestry workers actually doing some clearance on the land. The first real evidence, I guess, was from Barry himself, actually, when he started doing some survey work around there and some digging around. And he found a cluster of hazelnuts under a coppice hazel stool, and sent them off to an expert, to Elaine Hurrell, who was doing some hazel dormouse surveys at that time, and she confirmed that these were actually nibbled by the dormouse. And I'm lucky enough to have inherited those from Barry now, so I'll be able to show them to you when we can all get back together again. The Mammal Society also conducted some surveys, some national surveys, but within the Leicestershire and Rutland area, again, they weren't very successful. In the 1975-76 survey, there was only 1 record of dormice, no record of dormice in their 1993 survey, and one survey that I helped to be involved in 2001 also proved negative. So it's a bit of a dismal story actually for Leicestershire and Rutland. In Pickworth Greatwood, which is a small woodland to the northwest of the county of Rutland, we have had more success. Forest Enterprise put up 40 boxes there, and were interested in whether there were dormice in that particular woodland that they managed, partly because they had found them in the Fine Shades woodland, and other woodlands that they manage on a forestry basis. And they were successful in finding 2 dormice in 1995, 3 in 1996, and 1 in 1997. And really, it's the 1997 record, which is the last real record that we've got of dormice in our area. The top map on the pre-2000 map does actually show a record off to the west side of Leicester, and that's in an area north of Hinckley and Earl Shilton for people who know Leicestershire and Rutland well. This record actually dates from 1960, and it's from a place called Dadlington, and it's a record of a small mammal seen in a hedgerow. And because it's such an isolated record, there is actually doubt as to whether this is correct. But I guess irrespective of that, you know, the fact that it's such an old record of 1960, then it just makes sense that if we are going to do any further survey work, we would really concentrate to the east of the counties. I was involved in a survey myself in a study in 2000-2001, again looking at Ouston Wood and Lawn Bigwood, and I got the help from the trust who manages Lawn Bigwood, and from the Forest Enterprise who manage Ouston Wood. And again, these 2 woodlands are ancient woodlands, they're protected, and Natural England were also involved. So it was a real joint effort, and lots of effort was put into monitoring the boxes, but unfortunately no records of dormice were found. Searches for nuts were found, particularly around the area that Barry had found his, and again it just proved negative. So to all intents and purposes, it seemed that the dormouse had moved out of those 2 areas. And perhaps like the overall picture for the dormouse in Leicestershire and Rutland isn't too surprising when you look at the state of our forests. And the Leafield Forest was the area of woodland cover, and the map off to the left side of the screen shows what the woodland was like in 1556. It shows quite a lot of woodland, and those areas in boxes have actually disappeared. So at one time we had 23 ancient woodlands, and we had lots of mature hedgerows to connect those, and we had lots of gullies and streams that also act as the connectivity and the routes for dispersal. And unfortunately, a lot of those routes have been lost, and a lot of those woodlands have been lost. And this really means that if we have any dormice left, they could only be remnant populations, and they could actually be quite vulnerable. Sam, could you take me onto the next screen, please? Thank you. So we weren't ones to give up very easily. So despite the negative results, Barry and I wanted to see whether we could get other people involved and really try and find out, you know, were the dormice still in Pickworth Greatwood? Were they able to disperse around to other areas? And really to give us, you know, full confirmation of whether they had truly disappeared from Ouston Wood. So we set up a project in 2009, and we worked with Leicestershire County Council, with the City Council, the Wildlife Trust, the Forestry Commission, and another charity called Stepping Stones. So again, it was very much a joint project. And we used advice from all sorts of experts on the best methodologies to use. We used the traditional boxes. We used dormouse tubes that were fairly new to being used around the area at that time. And these were just corrugated pieces of plastic with a wood base that we could readily attach to branches of trees or to hedgerows and insert them there to basically see whether the dormice were present or absent. This was a quick and easy way of actually installing the tubes for the volunteers to get involved in installing them and to check them over a much wider area. It's a much cheaper and more efficient way of trying to test for presence or absence. And around that time, really, I guess the social media was really taking off. People were using emails a lot more. We had wildlife cameras, and we were able to sort of take advantage of people being able to use digital media a lot more to keep us informed. So we used all these methods, and we monitored the woodlands for a couple of years. So the 4 woodlands that you see on the map on the left-hand side: Euston Wood, Lawn Bigwood, Wakeley Wood, and Pickworth Greatwood. And again, unfortunately, we weren't successful in finding any field signs. No individuals were found, and it does appear that they have actually disappeared from these woodlands. However, we have to remember that we only monitored the woodlands really for 1 complete season, and in hindsight is a wonderful thing. And I think if we had been successful in getting further funding, it is certainly something that we would want to prolong those studies. And I'm sure that Sam will talk more about the robustness of getting good evidence behind that. A few years later, we did some work with the Forestry Commission again, and we looked at an area of woodland called Bedford Purlieu, which is just into the Northamptonshire area of the county, near to the Rutland border. And what we wanted to know about was, if we use a wildlife camera, would we actually be able to capture a dormouse coming in or out of a box? Because we were always worried that if we were going to check our dormouse boxes, was it the one occasion when we might have just missed them, even when we were just walking up to the box? Had we disturbed them? Had we missed that vital piece of evidence? So we worked in an area where we knew there were dormice, and we worked with the Forest Commission. We followed them around on surveys, and we were lucky enough to actually see the dormice, find the dormice, check them and monitor them, and send the records off to the National Monitoring Survey. And it was such a relief to actually be able to see these wonderful little endearing animals, having looked for them for so long. But the one thing that was clear to us was that by actually monitoring them with a camera, then they could quite clearly be picked up using that method. And in the bottom left-hand corner, if you look carefully, there's a small mammal just to the right side of the photograph. And as part of the video, this was captured coming out of the box, going down the tree, and then coming across to the right-hand side, sort of jumping over onto some of the stems of the hazel, and actually shooting up then off screen, as it is here. But it was quite visible, and so that gave us the confidence to know that if we were going to use this methodology in the future, then this was another way that we could account for the presence or absence. I'd like to say that certainly we haven't given up hope of them being here. They are in the neighbouring counties, and there is some way of getting some dispersal through to our own woodlands in the Rutland area. And perhaps during the talk out session at the end, I can explain a little bit more about how people might be able to get involved with that. But for now, I'd just like to hand back to Sam so that she can continue with her talk.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. It's really interesting to hear what's been going on in Leicestershire. Sad that you haven't got any records just yet, but hope for the future yet. So thank you very much. So we've talked kind of a bit about where dormice are in the country, or sadly where they aren't, or don't seem to be. But I wanted to talk about where they live in terms of habitat. So for the hazel dormice, their optimal habitat is a very biodiverse, sort of mixed age, mixed structure woodland. So an ideal kind of example of that would be a woodland that has some tall standards, maybe some oak, some beech, but not too many. It has an understory layer of hazel, elder. It might have vegetation that connects those layers as well, so ivy and honeysuckle. As I mentioned, dormice are arboreal species, so they really need that connectivity between different layers of the woodland. And also some sort of ground flora as well, in particular bramble can be really good for dormice. So, and we'll kind of talk about in a minute why that sort of structure is so important for them. But this is optimal habitat, and that doesn't mean that dormice don't show up in other areas. So there have been kind of records of dormice populations in purely coniferous woodlands, in heathland, and just in gorse where there's no other trees around, or maybe a little bit of blackthorn. So they really are quite adaptable. That said, it's probably worth remembering that these places that dormice are that are suboptimal habitat, it may be that they're remnant populations, it may be that they're just hanging on, and it may be that they need sort of further support for suitable habitat. They're typically associated with hazel, hence the name hazel dormice, mainly because traditional coppicing techniques of hazel would have meant that people would have come into contact with dormice a lot while doing work with hazel. And hazelnuts certainly make up a very important part of their diet, as we'll see in a little bit. But they aren't just associated with hazel, and they don't need hazel in an area to be present. So as I mentioned, they can be present in areas where there is absolutely no hazel. It's important to kind of note that mixed ages is really kind of essential. So a woodland that's managed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, that leaves areas that are kind of have new growth of woodland amongst areas of older woodland, that's really, really crucial for dormice. But what's also important is that a good woodland may be perfect for dormice in terms of the structure and kind of the species within. But if it's an isolated fragment of woodland and it's not connected to the wider landscape and not connected to other woodland, it's going to be unlikely to have dormice in there, or it may hold, again, a remnant population that may die out. And this is because of genetic diversity. So dormice need links within the landscape to other suitable woodland for juveniles to disperse into and back across, so between woodlands. If they don't have that, they may see inbreeding within the woodland, and that can lead to a decrease in genetic diversity and eventually will lead to the population dying out. So you can see on the landscape on the screen, you've got a really nice block of woodland running across kind of diagonally, some real chunks of woodland around to the east. And you can just about make out that there are some hedgerows in there as well, linking it. Some of the roads have kind of got trees either side. So this landscape is quite well connected, and this is an ideal landscape for dormice. So let's talk about what they eat. So I've mentioned that a variety of species of trees and shrubs is really important for dormice, and this is because they're sequential feeders. So dormice will depend on a wide range of food throughout the year. And they'll eat a whole load of things. So they'll eat pollen and nectar, they'll eat invertebrates, they'll eat berries, seeds and nuts. They may even eat fungi as well. What they don't eat are leaves. So they lack a cecum, which is a part of the anatomy that digests the fibre in leaves. They may eat very, very young leaves if they're desperate, but they won't eat leaves as a main part of their diet. But they'll eat almost anything else. And so if you think about the average year, in spring we'll start to see maybe blackthorn blossom out first, a little bit of nectar and pollen for dormice to eat. And there'll be other kind of flowering plants that they can consume. And then as we move into summer, usually the focus is on invertebrates. So in summer, invertebrates are really, really important to dormice. There's less kind of flowering plants around, but they haven't yet moved into kind of autumnal production of seeds and berries. But as we do move into autumn, dormice will depend on really high calorie foods. So hazelnuts and blackberries will absolutely make up a massive part of their diet if they're available in autumn. And this is so that they can put on a lot of body mass in preparation for hibernation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Dormice also, they don't move very far. So apart from when they disperse as juveniles, they actually need that range of food within about a hectare. So they won't go very far for food. So that's why it's quite important for there to be a variety of species and kind of a variety of age structures in the woodland within a small area to support even a single dormice. I'm going to run through the hazel dormice year before kind of going into a little bit more depth on some of this. So, and I will say this is a typical dormice year, but I would say that this probably is a little bit different for Shropshire. So this would be typical in more southern counties. In Shropshire, we tend to see things have moved sort of a month ahead. So let's look at when they're hibernating. So typically sort of November, December, dormice are in heavy sort of hibernation through to January. January, February, they're kind of occasionally coming out of hibernation. Maybe there's an odd warm day that brings them out of hibernation, but there'll be no food for them. And then February, March, they're frequently coming out of hibernation, probably finding some food source or maybe moving their hibernation site. March, April, they're becoming a lot more active. They might come out and be active for longer periods. They might come out and eat a bit more food. And then sort of April, May is when they're really fully active. So they're up in the trees, they're looking for their nest spots. They're gorging themselves on lots of lovely spring food ready for the breeding season. So typically, dormice will begin breeding in sort of May, June. And that's nest building and kind of mating. And then June, July, young can be born. And in counties where they have this early litter in June, July, they can then also go on to have a second litter. It doesn't always happen, but it's a possibility. But this is where it's a little bit different in Shropshire. We tend to see them become active a little bit later on and also go into hibernation a little bit later on. And we tend not to see young that early on in the year. We tend to get what we think is our first brood in September, October. Now, we can't be sure that there definitely isn't a first brood earlier on, but with our 5 years of monitoring, up until a surprise last year, which I'll mention in a second, we'd never found young in our boxes that early on in the year. We'd only found them later on. But last year, we did find 2 litters on a site in June and a later litter. So you could speculate that this may be one of the few positive impacts of climate change, and that there was a lot more food available in Shropshire, in a county that's further north and typically a little bit colder, that meant that they were able to breed a little bit earlier. But typically for us, that doesn't happen. And so we'll talk a little about the young in a minute, but then they will be fattening up for winter. So when the young have kind of left mum, everyone's fattening up for winter, everyone's gorging themselves on food, and then the young will disperse, go and find themselves a new bit of territory, and they'll go and hibernate. So let's talk a little bit more about breeding. Dormice will have about 4 or 5 young in their litters, and generally speaking, every single one of those dormice babies will survive through to becoming a juvenile and through to leaving mum. They're not really massively predated upon, probably because they live in such low densities anyway that they're quite hard to find. They don't make up a massive part of any predator's diets. It will happen, but generally speaking, all young will survive. So for the first few days, they are these little pink jelly beans that you can see on the left. They've got no fur, eyes are closed, and they're very vulnerable. And then sort of 1 to 2 weeks, they are what we call graze eyes closed. So you can see that their fur is a very sort of grey colour. And if you remember the earlier slides with adult dormice, their fur is a very sort of orangey colour. But when they're younger, and specifically in their first year, their fur shows a lot more grey. And at this stage, they're still quite vulnerable. They may be moving a little bit more, wriggling around, but they're not up and about. However, when they get just a little bit older, they are what we call grey's eyes open. Again, self-explanatory. They're still quite grey. Their eyes are open. And they are so active. So they're really hard to handle at this stage. They are like little kind of balls of popcorn, just popping about everywhere. Their feet are sort of too big for their body, and they have all this energy. They fly about all over the place. When we monitor them and we have them in big plastic bags, you just get little dormice bouncing around everywhere. And then at about 28 days, they can leave mum. So they can be independent of mum. They don't need her milk anymore. And you can see in the picture on the right, they've still got that sort of grey colouring to their fur, but they look like juveniles. They're sort of quite, you know, there's not really a neck showing between their head and their body. But at 28 days, they can leave mum. That doesn't mean they always do. If it's perhaps the late litter or the second brood in some counties, they may stay with mum up until the point where they go off to hibernate. If it's an early litter, maybe mum kicks them out sooner, or mum goes to another nest that she's got, leaves them alone and has a brood elsewhere. But the juveniles may stay together a little bit longer, even independent of mum. Now, dormice nests are very, very special. So a typical dormice nest has got an inner structure that's usually made from bark, and typically honeysuckle bark. It can be made from sort of grasses as well, dried grass. But it's a structure that's kind of woven together. And forgive the blurry picture on the left, but you can see that it's a ball shape. So it's not a cup shape. They do weave a ball. They do tend to have an entrance hole. And generally when mum's in there with the babies, she will kind of plug up the hole. And this is kind of a maternity nest I'm talking about now, but they can also make these as just resting nests for males or non-breeding females, but they generally don't put as much effort into them. And then so you've got this inner structure, and typically they will then insulate that nest with green leaves. So when I say green leaves, that's leaves that are taken off the tree. They take them sort of fresh off the tree rather than off the ground. Nests that are made from leaves off the ground, we say they're made with brown leaves. So there are wood mice will make nests with brown leaves. Yellow-necked mice will make nests with both brown and green leaves. But for dormice, typically speaking, they'll use green leaves. You can often find nests that are one or the other, though, that are just that inner structure or that are just green leaves. And the most beautiful dormice nest that I've ever found was a nest. It was in a nest box on a very young beech tree. The nest box was quite a large one. It was an older one, rather than these kind of smaller ones we use now. And the nest was made entirely from beech leaves, nothing else, no sort of bark, nothing else that you would think would hold it together. And yet it was still woven. And it's really kind of hard to describe it, but you could have taken it out of the box. It was sort of football size and it would have held its form. Absolutely magical. It would have been wonderful to see them build that. But as I mentioned, dormice don't read the books, and especially in Shropshire, and especially on one site in Shropshire in particular, dormice like to make very unusual nests. So you can see in the picture on the left, that is a nest made from fresh green grass. You can kind of see that it really doesn't take up much space in the box. It was probably about 1 to 2 inches off the bottom of the box. And it was woven, there was a woven structure in there. It would be understandable to kind of confuse this as maybe a harvest mice nest, because harvest mice will make nests from grass. However, they will make theirs and weave in surrounding vegetation so that the nest is, you can't remove it from the vegetation, whereas dormice won't do that. However, there was a litter of dormice in here, and mum never added any more to the nest. She didn't build it up anymore, add any more leaves, anything like that. This is how the nest stayed. She raised the young in it, the young survived. Don't know why she chose to make it with grass, but there you go. And the nest box on the right, this is from the same site, and this is a bracken nest. So these nest boxes have quite a small hole at the back. So I would love to have seen the dormice dragging the bracken fronds into the nest box and building this nest. But again, it was woven, it was structured, and you could have taken that out of the box and it would have stayed together as a sort of an independent structure. So I don't know why these dormice decided to make nests this way. It was not for a lack of available material on site. There was plenty of honeysuckle, plenty of trees with lovely fresh green leaves. Maybe it's just a preference. So let's talk about hibernation and torpor. How am I doing for time? So hibernation and torpor are similar in that they are states in which an animal will reduce their heartbeat, which will reduce their breathing and their blood flow and kind of their breathing rate and their use of energy. So it's a strategy for surviving winter. The dormice, as I mentioned, will go into hibernation for kind of a long period over winter. And they will hibernate generally on the ground. So their breeding nests are usually made where they live, up in the trees, maybe in bramble, maybe in hollows in trees, but hibernation will be down at ground level, typically speaking. And it will be in places where the temperature isn't likely to fluctuate and where it might be a little bit moist so that they don't desiccate and dry up. So this could be in leaf litter, coppice stalls, it could be in old mouse holes, that kind of thing. They will sometimes build a little hibernation nest as well. So that will be a little woven nest, but it will be sort of sloppily made. It won't have kind of the structure of the breeding nests. Now, torpor, however, is like a mini hibernation. So it's the body goes into the same state. It's kind of reduced heartbeat, reduced breathing. It's to conserve energy. But this is more in response to inclement weather. So usually we find dormice in torpor early on in spring, perhaps when they've come out of hibernation and before they find lots of food, they need to conserve their energy. Or maybe later on, just before they're going into hibernation, they'll be fattening up. There'll be cold days, so they'll be going into torpor. And it's usually just for a few hours at a time. But they are quite vulnerable in these states, so they can take about 20 minutes to wake up if you disturb them when they're in torpor. And unfortunately, a gruesome fact for you, although I've said that animals don't really predate on them all that much, there has been evidence that yellow-necked mice in particular will eat dormice brains when they're in torpor. That's not very nice. But torpid dormice, those are kind of a lot of the photos that you see of dormice where they're all curled up, their tails wrapped around them and they're asleep, they're in torpor. That's kind of the typical kind of sleepy dormice. I just wanted to touch briefly on legislation surrounding dormice. It's not the most interesting subject, but it is absolutely essential. So dormice are protected under masses of legislation. They are a European protected species and they're also protected under UK legislation. I'm not going to go through all the pieces that protect them, but essentially what you need to know is that every individual dormice, every single nest, that's maternity, resting, hibernation, their resting places, so this could be a spot where they rest without a nest, so it could be ivy, hedgerow, and just generally those areas where they exist are all protected by law, and they're protected from destruction and disturbance. So in order to handle dormice and to potentially disturb them, you do need a license. And probably haven't got the time to go into licensing around dormice now, but why would you need a license? We mentioned monitoring. Helen's talked about monitoring as well. In 1993, the People's Trust for Endangered Species set up the National Dormice Monitoring Programme. And essentially, the aim of that programme is to collect data on dormice. So it involves putting nest boxes up in a wood and those being checked. Nest boxes are very similar to bird boxes, except they've got the hole in the back of the box, which hopefully will encourage dormice to use them. We do still find birds to use the boxes, and we find dormice in bird boxes as well. But hopefully it replicates kind of a hollow in a tree that they use. There tends to be about 50 on a site, and the minimum kind of amount of checks to do is a pre-breeding check, which is May or June, and a post-breeding check, which is September, October. But you can check them monthly. And in Shropshire we do, and this is so that we can collect as much data as possible. And also we are working on training up as many people as possible to have their licence, because we want to be able to monitor more and more woodlands in Shropshire. So we do monitor our boxes monthly. And what we do when we monitor them essentially is we have a bright yellow duster, we bung up the hole in the back of the box, and this is so that any mammals can't escape. Bright yellow, so that if we forget it, we can look back and see where it is. Absolutely crucial that you don't leave a duster in a box. Obviously, if there's mammals in there, you leave your duster in, they can't get out. And if we have dormice or other mammal species, then we will take the nest box off the tree. So it's important that the nest box isn't fixed to the tree. It has to be removable. So we usually attach with wire or bungee cord. And then we check the nest. If we have any animals in there, we will collect biometric data. So that's their weight, that could be their breeding condition, their sex. If there's a litter, we'll count how many are in there. We might weigh them depending on their life stage. We'll record whether they're torpid or active. And any identifying features about them, such as injuries or kind of white marks on them that not all dormice have. So all that data goes to the PTS. And why is it important to collect that data? Why do we do that and go through this kind of possible disturbance of dormice? Well, the National Dormice Monitoring Programme, as I mentioned, it was set up in 1993. And the graph on your screen shows the decline in dormice since that time. And specifically, since the year 2000 until the year, I think it was 2016, when the report was produced, dormice declined by 50%. If we weren't monitoring them, we wouldn't know that. They are a very difficult species to see because they're nocturnal, arboreal, and live in low densities. They're not a species that you're just going to encounter. So monitoring them in this way, collecting data on them, which also can be analysed with things like their weights, pre and post hibernation, it's really, really essential. Without it, we wouldn't know just how much they were struggling. But why are dormice in decline? So why have they declined that much? So ancient Britain was almost entirely forested, but with an ever-changing kind of mosaic of little glades and scrubby patches. And this was maintained by grazing herbivorous megafauna. And then when humans wiped them out, humans started to use woodland products and coppice woodland in a way that almost replicated what the megafauna had been doing. And it meant that it created this sort of, again, changing kind of mosaic within the woodland. You had some areas where it had been cleared, some areas where there was new woody growth that produces more food for dormice. But now natural woodland products have become a bit obsolete. So we no longer use hazel poles for hurdles and fences and tools. And so woodlands have become neglected. So there's no human management, and we've made our megafauna extinct, so there's no kind of natural management. And because of that lack of management, woodland will revert to high forest. And what that means is the big trees such as the oak, the beech, ash, sycamore, they all have time to grow up. They shade out the woodland, no light can get in, and you tend to lose your understory layer, you lose any bramble, you lose any kind of connecting kind of honeysuckle, ivy, that kind of thing. And the woodland becomes a bit dark, it's not producing as much food, any fruits or things, so it becomes unsuitable for dormice. Further to that, with humans kind of settling, becoming sedentary and clearing large areas of land for settlements and agriculture, obviously a lot of woodland was lost. So not only was woodland less managed, but also there was just less of it. And furthermore, intensification of agricultural practices has meant that hedgerows have been removed in great amounts from the land. So any pockets of woodland that are left are often not well connected to each other. And as I mentioned before, it's really, really crucial that woodlands are connected for dormice. Otherwise, you will lose them in the woodland, they will become locally extinct. But unfortunately, hedgerows were ripped out to make bigger fields for bigger farming machinery. And those hedgerows that are left, they are often either undermanaged, which means that there's no kind of cutting of them at all, and some trees will grow to be large trees. They'll shade out parts of the hedge and you'll end up with a gappy hedge with no connectivity. Or they can be over managed, and this can mean that the hedges are cut all sides of the hedge every year. They have no chance to produce any fruit, so they're not really going to support dormice that are moving through them in terms of providing them food. So hedgerow management is actually really, really important for dormice as well. And furthermore, especially more recently, climate change is a factor in the decline of dormice. So in the UK, what climate change means for us is we're seeing milder winters. And this can mean that dormice are coming out of hibernation, and certainly other hibernating animals. They come out of hibernation more frequently because there are warmer days. That's what they're adapted to wake up to. But there's no food because it's not yet spring. And if they go in and out of hibernation too much, the amount of energy that costs means that they have no energy left, and there's no food to replenish that, and so they will die. It is worth mentioning that hibernation is actually the biggest natural killer of dormice. So between 40 and 70% of dormice will die during hibernation. But obviously with the impacts of climate change, that will exacerbate that. And a further impact is we see wetter summers in the UK, and this means that there are less invertebrates around for dormice. And so in summer, when they haven't really got much other kind of food available for them, and they depend on invertebrates, that isn't there for them. So it's having kind of a detrimental effect in many ways. So what can you do to help dormice? Now, obviously, this might depend on where in the country you are, where you're watching this from. If you are in Shropshire, you can email us, so shropshiredormice@gmail.com. We do have a general mailing list where we send out updates and events, and we have 2 mailing lists for volunteers. So we have our volunteers that are training for their licence, and we also have a habitat management team as well. So in Shropshire, we don't just want to monitor dormice, we don't just want to sort of watch them decline. We're really, really keen to be active. And this is why for us, the habitat management work is a big part of what we do. So if you are local, you can join us. We've got a Facebook group as well. That's quite active and it's quite nice. There's lots of photos and things. But also most counties that have dormice will have a dormice group. So if you're not in Shropshire, perhaps look up to see if there is a local dormice group. And if there isn't a local dormice group, you could join, as Helen mentioned, the Leicestershire and Rutland Mammal Group. There may be scope in the future to kind of help out with dormice related projects. Again, if you're in another county, you'll have a local mammal group or your local wildlife trust as well. So simply joining those and kind of becoming a member that kind of donates to the groups can help work be carried out and can help support the work that they do. And I will mention the People's Trust for Endangered Species again. They do, like I said, they set up the National Dormice Monitoring Programme. They have built so many resources on their website that are really useful for kind of training and for knowledge on dormice. So you can become a member or donate to them as well. And something practical you can do that you don't really need to be trained too much for and you don't need a license for is to carry out a nibbled nut hunt. So dormice open hazelnuts in a very, very specific way. And once you get your eye in, it's fairly easy to identify. If you go on YouTube and search Shropshire Dormice Group, we do have a short training video on how to ID nibbled nuts and how to carry out a survey. It's really important that you get landowner permission if you want to do that. And like I said, it can be difficult initially, but once you've got your eye in, it's a brilliant way of going out and trying to help. You might be able to make a record just from one nibbled nut in an area where dormice haven't been recorded in ages or have never been recorded. So that's something practically you can do. So that's all from me for now, but I believe there is time for questions. So if there are any, more than happy to answer.
Yes, there are.
Oh.
You're going to deal with them.
Are you?
Should I have a look, or will someone?
Well, Jack, are you there, Jack? Hello, Jack.
Yeah, sorry, I'm here. The video's not working. but I'm just seeing if it'll start back on.
Well, I'll start whilst you get sorted. Do you have any news, Sam, of any introductions in Derbyshire? Someone is asking.
To be honest, I don't know. You'd probably have to contact. Now, let me think. Derbyshire. Let's go
North of
back
us.
to the map. Let's go all the way back and let's have a look. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but it would be worth looking up that People's Trust for Endangered Species report on reintroductions to see if there have been any done yet. Now the report was, I don't know when it was a bit later than 2013, I think, so hopefully it would have more recent information. And again, if there's a local dormice group or a local mammal group, it's worth contacting them and asking. You know, there are always people that are kind of keen to yeah, there's always things going on that people are keen to kind of kickstart, and maybe if there's someone that's interested in Derbyshire, maybe you could get in touch with them and hopefully help with projects. So
Okay, thank you. Jack, are you taking over with the questions?
Yeah, I can do. I don't. The camera seems to have just completely stopped working. I can't seem to fix it. But I think if you can hear me, then I can just go through the questions.
You can.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So we've had a question about halfway through from Steph Bevan, and she's asked if the dormouse populations are competitive or territorial, or do they kind of cohabit quite well?
yeah, is that so? I don't know whether Steph is able to clarify whether she means with other species or sort of territorial within species, but I'll try and kind of tackle both of them just in case we don't hear any more from Steph. So it is considered that dormice show male to male aggression. I will say from my own experience, we have had males and breeding males cohabiting in the same nest box, so they don't seem all that territorial from my experience, but it is considered that they can be. Generally, because they do live in such low densities, they'd be unlikely to kind of encounter each other anyway. And with regards to other species, I mean, there will be, so in our nest boxes, we often get, we do have yellow-necked mice in Shropshire, and they can be quite aggressive. We do find that dormice nests can sometimes have been, we'll find a nice dormice nest one month, the next month we go and check that box and the nest has been torn to shreds by a mouse. So if a mouse goes in and rips up the nest and they're very messy, they will kind of leave droppings and pee all over the nest, a dormice is not going to go back and use that nest. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, that should be fine. I do think she did mean with like dormice, with kind of how they compete with each other and everything. So yeah. So okay, and then we've had a question from Sue Brown, which might be, I think this is quite an interesting one. If they ever live in like people's gardens, if they have like fruit bushes or I guess maybe other kind of food supplies for them.
Yeah, so last year, or possibly the year before now, or it's all kind of merged into one this last year, we did see a photo in Shropshire of a dormouse on a bird feeder in someone's garden in broad daylight. So yeah, absolutely, they'll be in people's gardens. I mean, if the gardens are well connected to nice big kind of suitable woodlands, then they will absolutely come into gardens to feed. I wouldn't expect that dormice would exist within a garden if it's not connected to other suitable habitat nearby. But yeah, absolutely. If you're connected to a woodland and you put, you know, nuts and fruits and things out for dormice, yeah, they'll find it.
Okay. Yeah. And then we've had this is a question from Lorien quite recently. So really interested in the impact of climate change due to warm winters. Is there any references for this or places that people could read more?
I have to admit, I don't know off the top of my head. What I would recommend is going to the PTS website. They just have sort of a wealth of resources on dormice there. So I would bet that if there are really good references, they'll be on their website. I'd have a look there.
Okay, thanks for that. And then let's see what else we got.
I'll kick in with one, Jack.
Yeah, sure. Just scrolling down there.
Sorry, Phil Parker asks, we live in Norfolk. It appears it's one of the only counties in England that have always had dormice absent. Is there any reason for this?
I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know. I know when I looked up about Leicestershire in particular, obviously that they were marked as rare even in 1885. That was to do with the fact that Leicestershire has never really been that wooded. And I'm trying to think, I'm not too good on my geography, but perhaps Norfolk is a county that's never really been that wooded. I'm not sure if I'd be correct in saying that. So perhaps there's never really been that much available habitat for them.
Okay, thank you. Are you kicking in, Jack?
Yeah, I can do. I was just trying to answer one that I thought I could just answer from Keith, but
well, I'll kick in once you look.
okay, yeah.
Keith Falconer asks if the recording will be available on YouTube, and I can answer yes. Sam, I think you'll agree that's okay.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, that's the one I was just trying to type an answer to, just as you were trying to speak to me as well. So we've got a question a bit further down. This might be one for Helen to answer, actually, if Helen is there.
Yeah.
Yep, Alan Herbert is just asking if dormouse could be reintroduced to Rutland at some stage, and that might be one that's interesting to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, it has been considered in the past, particularly because of the absence from some of the woodlands. However, I think what we wanted to try and find out about was why they had disappeared from there. I think there is a reluctance to reintroduce a species as vulnerable as the dormouses into a woodland habitat unless we're satisfied that the structure and the management of that woodland is cared for, is considered into the future. And actually, when you look at some of the reintroductions in Derbyshire and in Nottinghamshire, although some have been very successful, they've actually recently reintroduced more dormice into Treswell Wood in Nottinghamshire. So I would say, yes, it's something that we will certainly consider, but I think there's a little bit more work to be done looking at some of the woodlands where we could reintroduce and actually have that assurance from the land managers that they will manage them in the future.
Okay, thanks for that one. Okay, so we've got Sarah Allen is asking if they don't really, if they mind actually being held in people's hands when they're being monitored and surveyed in the nest boxes.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I was going to put in a slide because a question linked to that is do dormice bite? Now they generally don't mind being handled. They're very kind of docile creatures, and when they do, if they do get stressed out and nip you, it generally doesn't break skin. The photo I wanted to include was a friend who was monitoring, and she did get bitten by a dormice and it did bleed, but this was a pregnant dormice, so it's understandable. So it's worth mentioning that we are very, very aware of if creatures are stressed. So if dormice do seem stressed, we will process them very, very quickly and put them back into nest boxes. We especially won't handle sort of mums, lactating mothers, pregnant females for too long. And there have been studies using, I think it was radio tagging, or it might have been microchipping, but there was a study to look at whether dormice will go back into the same nest boxes even after they've been monitored. So, you know, essentially, does handling disturb them? And it showed that dormice will go back to the same nest boxes even if they're handled month on month. It doesn't seem to bother them. They don't seem to want to move. And just from personal experience, I mentioned Stumpy right at the start. So we saw Stumpy for 3 years running, and whenever we found him in a nest box for that year, he would show up in that nest box again and again, and he certainly didn't mind being handled. Now, obviously, all animals will be different. So again, it's just being aware, paying attention to factors that show that they're stressed. So, for example, extensive cleaning in rodents can demonstrate that they're stressed. So if we see those, we'll be mindful of that and get them back in the boxes as quick as possible.
Okay.
I'll kick in with two questions from Gordon and Vivian. Are there easy visible differences between male and females, and do the male and females build the nests? And I shall add to that and ask, what is the interaction between male and females, particularly with regard to reproduction? Is it just mating and the male goes away, or does it play any part in the rearing?
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, the females will build the nests. They will often build multiple nests so that they have different areas to go. Now, it's considered that the males won't won't help in rearing. So obviously the female will be kind of feeding them with her milk, and she'll be going out and feeding herself. So unlike some species where maybe the male will come and bring the female some food, dormice, they don't really eat in their nests. They're very sort of neat creatures. So it will be that the female will go out, get herself some food, and then come back to the young. The males will generally stay away. However, that said, we have had boxes where we've had mum juveniles, and we have had a male as well, which may have been the male that was responsible for the litter. So we have seen that in the nest boxes. And in terms of kind of differences between them, no, there is not a very easy sort of difference between male and female, and actually sexing them is really hard. So for some kind of small mammals, it's quite easy to sex them and tell if they're male and female by looking at the genitals, but often we can spend a long time looking at dormice genitals because it can be really hard to tell the difference between male and female. When they're in kind of peak breeding season, there can be very obvious kind of differences then. But yeah, have I answered all parts of the question,
I
David?
think so, yes.
Yeah, 3 in 1 there, so that's good. And we've got one from Adam, just asking is there any dormouse ecology books, and I'm sure you could probably recommend quite a few.
Yes. So this one is wonderful. Hopefully you can see that on the screen. Sven Buchner, and I'm not going to try and pronounce the other name because I will probably do it to service and get it wrong. But just this little book on the hazel dormice, absolutely wonderful. There are a couple of other books as well, but that one I really recommend. I think it's really well written. It references a lot of fascinating studies, and it's really got everything you need to know about dormice. So it's got lots of nice photos as well, which is always important.
Great.
I'll kick in. Dave Robinson, how widespread are dormice across the rest of Europe, across the rest of the world?
Yes, so the hazel dormice is present in Europe. There is not, unfortunately. Oh, sorry, is that someone? I thought someone else was speaking then. There's not as extensive a kind of monitoring program in Europe as there is in the UK. So unfortunately, we don't have the data to tell us just how abundant they are in Europe. We know there are certain countries where they're studied. In particular, I think it's Belgium. There is someone called Herdler, and she has done some incredible research on dormice there. So we know a bit more about them in Belgium. But yeah, they are a European species, so they are in Europe, but not a lot of data to say exactly where or how many.
Okay, thank you. Jack, if you've picked another one. Well, whilst you think, I'll ask one from Anne. How far can a dormouse travel? I think you said they stay fairly local, but...
Yeah, I think, so off the top of my head, I think there was one study that showed a dormouse travelling about 387 metres, and I think that was a juvenile dispersing. So they will travel the furthest distances while they're dispersing. They won't really travel all that far in a woodland. You know, they like to have all their food close and everything. Yeah, so that's probably about kind of the most specific figures I could give you, but they do tend to stay pretty kind of true to an area, really.
Okay, thank you. I think we've covered most of the questions. We possibly have missed a few, and I apologise if that's the case, but have you picked any more out, Jack?
Yeah, we've had one come in from Wales, and there's somebody who is just kind of stating that they found dormouse in a state of torpor in an old pied flycatcher nest, and she's just asking, or he's just asking, if you or Helen have encountered that during any of your surveys.
So any encounters of dormice in kind of other nests aren't theirs? Yeah, so dormice that are kind of just looking for a resting place, they will absolutely use other nests, in particular wren nests, and I guess off the top of my head, pied flycatcher nests are probably quite well insulated, so they will use other nests. We have found them even in kind of old mouse nests of brown leaves, and they've kind of just built some sort of structure in there. So they'll tend to kind of try and use what's around them to build themselves a little structure. But yeah, no, they will use other nests. In terms of kind of what I've experienced during our 5 years of monitoring, I think we might have found a torpor dormouse in a wren nest once, but more often than not, we'll either find them in the maternity nest, in a little resting nest, or just in the box with nothing in it. Sometimes they've just dragged a couple of green leaves in, maybe for something soft to sleep on in the box. So yeah, that's it from my own experience.
I just add to that when we were monitoring our boxes, and I expect you found the same, Sam, that early in the spring the birds will readily use them. The blue tits will, and the shrews and the wrens will use those boxes to to breed themselves, and often during the process of the monthly monitoring for dormice, once the birds have fledged, then we would remove the nest, partly for a health and safety. The ticks associated with those and the mites and everything aren't going to be good for the dormice either. So from a health and safety point of view, then it's just a process to go through. So although we might be sort of removing some of the material that might be useful for dormice, I think it actually outweighs the pros and cons of it by reducing the risk of infection to the dormice themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was actually reading just earlier as well, most studies will show that dormice won't even use kind of their own old nests for breeding anyway. But obviously as resting, they're likely to use anything that's nice and soft. So yeah, we do the same. Later on in the season, remove bird nests. We also we kick out wood mice. We get rid of their nests as well. So.
Okay, we've got a question from Millie as well, which I think is going to be worth answering from a legal point of view, and she has just asked if you put up a nest box with a camera in it, or can you put up a nest box with a camera if you don't then touch the box?
Yeah, definitely. So I know there are some nest boxes now that you can get kind of built-in cameras, that you can then watch on a screen separate, as long as you're not disturbing them. So it would be worth checking if the camera has sort of flash or anything on it. So it would be disturbance if the camera was kind of flashing or there was any lights that the dormice would be disturbed by. But otherwise, if you were to put up a nest box and you don't touch it, and there are dormice in there and you leave them alone, then yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, is there anything else you want to ask from the questions? I think there's a couple more, David.
I think we probably need to finish now. There are still some questions coming in, but I think we've covered most of them, and thanks to everyone who's sent in questions. Apologies to those who may not have had an answer, but can we thank Sam for answering all of those questions, and indeed Helen. And I think and Harriet will probably come in soon, but I would like to thank both the speakers, Sam and Helen, for a fabulous evening. As I said, I think when we had a talk on moles, I said most people probably have seen moles less frequently than they have seen badgers. I think you have Well, we definitely would say the same for dormice. I think there would be very few of our viewers, certainly in Leicestershire and Rutland, that have seen dormice, whereas they probably have seen some badgers. But it's been a really fascinating evening with a lot of absolutely great detail. And of course, it's great to hear the local news from Helen, but very disappointing. And obviously it's not easy to have a reintroduction into Leicestershire, but maybe along with an improvement in our wildlife capacity, our habitats over the next few decades, we might see them particularly creeping in from Northamptonshire. So a big thank you. We have to do a vertical applause, but thank you to our both our speakers. And hopefully Harriet is somewhere with us. Over to you, Harriet, if you're there. There she is, I can see her.
Thanks, David. Yeah, just to add what David said, thank you so much, Sam, and thank you so much, Helen, for joining us. A really, really interesting talk. Definitely learned a lot about dormice. And we've got some really wonderful comments coming in, people saying how much they've enjoyed it and how informative it was. So thank you so much. Such a brilliant evening, and I'll let everybody get on with the rest of their night. So thank you for joining us, everybody. Don't miss our next online talk, which is next week, and it's all about bird watching in the spring and summer with our chairman of the Great Bowden local group, and he'll be sharing lots of lovely photos that he's been taking. Yes, head to our website to book onto that. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
And thank you to you, Harriet, for your support tonight.
No problem.
And to you, Jack. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, David, and the rest of the Badger group for organising this wonderful talk. So, okay, we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Good night.
Nice to see you. Bye.
Bye.